So first off, what we have to understand with Iran is that it's very, very different from most other countries in that region, right? And actually, I want to give a massive shout out to Visual Politics. So they're a really, really good channel. And actually, their video on Iran more recently was actually a big inspiration, right? So the title of it is something along the lines of like how Iran could be like the next Australia, which sounds a little bit confusing, but basically what they're trying to say is Iran has got a lot of potential, but they're held back by the political regime which they happen to have at the moment. And that regime is as a consequence of this revolution. So that kind of got me thinking, right, let's do a video on that. So Iran has got a very, very long history. Yeah? First of all, up until the 1930s, it was known as Persia, right? And the people of Iran are Persian as opposed to Arabs, which when you think of the Middle East, a lot of people don't really know much. Like they would be like, oh, they're all Arabs, right? The Persians have a very, very long history. You think about like, 300 Spartans, like obviously, like you've seen the film 300, etc., etc. So they basically had an empire stretching all the way from the Balkans all the way to India, basically. So it's very, very, very massive. And also, well, because of Iran's geography, it's very, very difficult for countries to ever conquer them and stuff, right? Well, that's why their borders, from memory, their borders have remained the same since about like the 1700s, right? So they've been invaded a few times, but never fully like conquered, yeah, and their territory's never been like fully like taken away from them. So Iran is, on the face of it, a relatively stable country. So you'd be forgiven for kind of thinking, right, okay, why are they having such difficulties? Well, part of that is also because of their history, right? So Iran, unlike most countries in the Middle East, are Shia Muslims as opposed to Sunni Muslims, okay? So kind of long to get into the differences between them. It's all to do with like the kind of like which prophet like end up being, no, I don't know. It's something to do with the Prophet Muhammad. Like some people follow his like nephew or some people, whatever. The point being that there's a difference between Sunnis and Shias. I can't tell you the difference, so definitely check out a channel which will help you on that, right? I can't. Sorry. But anyway, the point being that they are different from Sunni Muslims, and also as well the setup that they have in Iran is kind of different from how it is in Sunni Muslim countries. So like the Shia clergy that they have there called the ulama, I think I'll pronounce it right, hopefully. Well, even if I did, whatever. Yeah, so they are very influential within Iranian politics and have been for many, many centuries, right? So within the context of this revolution, we have to kind of start it back, many kind of decades before, and we'll talk about the Tobacco Revolt of 1891. So within that, you had, the British never conquered Iran, but they did have a lot of interest, yeah, like a lot of like business interest, right? And one man in particular basically set up a monopoly with regard to tobacco, right? So the problem with monopoly is that, over time the prices end up going up because there's no competition to like drive down the prices, and all the suppliers, they've only got one person to sell to and stuff, right? So it's quite, it's basically quite difficult, yeah, to bring down the prices, which means that for the average person, they have got no choice here. Like if you don't like, if you don't like Coca-Cola, for instance, you can get Pepsi. If you don't like this or that, you can get other things, right? If you only have one thing, you're kind of stuck for choice, right? And obviously people in those days who, many people smoked, obviously. And the fact that they were basically being priced out of their vice, yeah, really annoyed a lot of people. So the religious clerics basically declared a fatwa, right? So the fatwa is basically, I don't know what the translation for it in English is, but it's kind of, it's almost like a religious decree and stuff. Yeah, it's basically kind of, where you kind of go, I'll declare fatwa on this person and stuff. Yeah, so people basically rose up in like protest against it, and this ended up having really significant consequences for Persian politics for quite a long time. So fast forward now a few decades to 1906, and you basically had a new constitution for Iran, which limited the power of the shah. So the shah is basically like the king of Iran, right? So the power of the shah was restricted, and also the power of the ulama end up being greatly enhanced, right? Because Iran, within this new constitution, was clearly stated as being an Islamic country. But the problem is that the shahs of Iran tended to be quite like secular, tended to be quite liberal, tended to be very westernized, right? So they wanted Iran to basically follow the model of many Western countries, which meant that this often ended up clashing with the more kind of like religiously like conservative people of Iran. In particular, in like the 1920s and 1930s, the Shah tried to implement some liberal reforms, basically banning Islamic clothing, so headscarves, like hijabs, like kind of burqas, etc., etc. All those things being banned, and on top of that, you end up having the dissolution of the separation of the sexes, yeah. So men and women, rather than being kept separate, could now obviously like intermingle and stuff, right? And this obviously annoyed many people and radicalized a great many people. In particular, one of the people it radicalized was a young student at the time who was Ruhollah, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Ruhollah Khomeini, who later obviously became known as Ayatollah Khomeini, right? And this was the person who led the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Now, fast forward a few decades, and we have the early 1950s. You have someone called Mosadek who ends up being elected as the leader of Iran. However, he was backed by communists, and within the context of the Cold War, obviously, like the British had like their old like kind of like imperial like kind of interest within it, yeah, because obviously he came in and nationalized like big parts of the economy, in particular BP. So that ended up becoming the Anglo-Iranian oil company and stuff, and this annoyed the British. But the Americans didn't want to just support like Britain's imperial interest. However, within the context of them being told this guy's a communist, yeah, like they basically end up plotting a CIA-backed like coup, and this was called Operation Ajax. And this was basically to set up so that Mossadegh would be overthrown by the people, and then the Shah was reinstated with absolute power. And then also as well, you had the Savak, which was basically the it was the Shah's security forces, and these people would imprison many people who spoke out, torture them, kill them, etc., etc. So it's a very like repressive state here, and anyone who kind of spoke out against the Shah was like really clamped down on, or was like exiled and stuff, right? And this ended up happening to Khomeini. He ended up being one of the people who ended up having to go into exile. But to kind of like ease people's tensions, yeah, what the Shah ended up implementing was something known as the White Revolution in 1963. So the White Revolution, the name for like it being the White Revolution is to make it like clear it's not a red revolution, so it's not like a communist kind of thing, yeah. However, as many kind of like reforms end up being implemented, such as like education, so literacy end up like really shooting up in Iran. The number of like university educated people really increased. The amount of like urbanization and industrialization really increased as well. So you had a lot of people moving from the farms, right, coming from the countryside to the major cities, right? And also you had many secular laws. So again, they tried to implement these things where like women were given like the right to vote, and like women were given more like kind of like powers and etc., etc. And yeah, so it's basically a lot more of a kind of like liberal kind of time. However, the problem with the White Revolution is this. On the one hand, it annoyed the religious conservatives, yeah, because they were like, hold on, you're giving women like more rights, you're being too liberal and stuff. Like, they were so liberal that there ended up being a big scandal actually that involved the Shah's family, in which like they basically oversaw this. It wasn't like someone who was a member of the family did this, yeah, but there was like a faux same-sex marriage, right? So pretend same-sex marriage in a country, Iran has had a long history of homosexuality, yeah, and people being relatively tolerant to it. Like even in the time when Iran was a Islamic country, right, people still were relatively tolerant to it. However, as with all religions, there's peaks and troughs in terms of how strictly people tend to adhere to the faith. So whereas in prior centuries it might have kind of just been overlooked, in more recent times people kind of end up being a kind of a conservative backlash, yeah, like to this, yeah. So this caused nationwide scandal when this was found out, and it was seen as like, look how degenerate they are, look at how immoral like the royal family are, look at how like westernized that they are and stuff, yeah, like they're going completely against Islamic teachings on like kind of like homosexuality. So this ended up really radicalizing a lot of like socially conservative people, right? On the flip side, you end up also annoying a lot of like socially liberal people, yeah, like these kind of university educated people, you know, highly literate, highly well educated, etc., etc., and also highly secular. They are seeing like the Western world, you know, during the 1960s, all these freedoms and stuff, but they're also seeing countries like America and Britain where people have the freedom of speech, people can like, you know, dissent against the government and they don't get locked up, and they, you know, so this also kind of didn't bode well for the Shah, because you're telling all these people, look at this, yeah, we want to become more like the West, but at the same time, using the Savak, you're cracking down on people. So simultaneously with the White Revolution, you end up annoying both the conservatives and the liberals, which, yeah, is a great recipe for success, and like, you know, I can't see any problem with this long term at all. Now, fast forward a few years to 1979, and what ended up happening is you had demonstrations, right? So this was mainly against like the repression and suppression that was, suffered by the Shah, and so people were kind of protesting against that. Also, as well, it didn't help that the economy wasn't doing so well in the late 70s. Well, for everyone in the world. So yeah, so it basically kind of culminated in basically a popular uprising, which eventually ended up overthrowing the Shah. So what ended up happening in this kind of situation is very similar to what happened in Russia in 1917. So you had an initial kind of like popular uprising where people, you know, just wanted to kind of like overthrow the old autocratic regime. But then what ended up happening is that a smaller, like more radicalized group at a later stage end up basically taking over that revolution. So in the same way with the Bolsheviks, like, you know, in the October Revolution, they end up taking over. In the same way, the Islamists end up taking over as well. And this is because Ayatollah Khomeini ended up returning to the country, and he then led the Islamic Revolution, which, you know, that basically gave Iran like the current kind of system that it has now. So although Iran is on the face of it a democracy, is a thing where, you know, the clergy have a large degree of power in terms of, you know, the press, in terms of political parties, even like the candidates for political parties, right? So yes, they'll have elections, but it's a thing of these people already been okayed by like the clergy and stuff, yeah. So it's a thing where like the only people who are really allowed to kind of even stand for office yet in Iran are people who like the Ayatollahs already have control over. And on top of that, they end up, you know, basically running the economy into the ground. So what we can look at is this, yeah. So in 1977, the economy of Iran was 65% larger than that of South Korea's at the time. And it was 26% larger than that of Turkey. However, fast forward to the present day, and we can see that Turkey has an economy twice the size of Iran, and we can see South Korea has an economy which is 4 times larger than Iran. So what we've seen is actually like, you know, them either going backwards in some cases, or at very least like stagnating, or just not growing as quickly as the rest of the world. And yes, of course, you can blame on sanctions and stuff, but the sanctions only have a relatively limited like impact, and also the sanctions have only been in recent years as a result of like the you know, Iran's nuclear program. So yes, the sanctions had some part on it, but also it's to do with the internal mismanagement of the economy, yeah, by the Ayatollahs. So first off, you end up having a reversal of what the Shah wanted. So the Shah put in a lot of privatization for different things. However, when the Ayatollahs took over, they ended up nationalizing a lot of things, right? So much so that, you know, over 80% of the economy in the 1980s was controlled by the state. Yeah, it was, you know, centrally planned. So in many ways, Iran under the Ayatollahs is kind of a like communist like state and stuff almost, right? And even to this present day, it's estimated that about 60% of the economy is controlled by the state. And, you know, even Ahmadinejad, who's quite a conservative president that they had like up until relatively recently, even he said that 60% of Iran's economy is held in the hands of pretty much around 300 people, right? So big levels of corruption, big levels of inequality and stuff, and also you had a large amount of a capital flight, because if you shut down people's businesses, people, you know, will not gonna want to stay around, right? So they go to other places which are much freer and stuff, and where their property rights are going to be much more secured. So as a result of this, you end up having a massive brain drain. People left the country, you know, and then on top of that, you had the Iran-Iraq war. So Saddam Hussein, you know, like he wanted to expand into like parts of southern Iran where you have a majority Arab population, and basically you end up having some long war which went from 1980 to 1988, where people were literally, you know, it's trench warfare like it's World War One, right? Except it lasted twice as long as World War One. And you know, the Americans kind of get involved in this as well, because you know the Iranians end up, you know, taking US people in their embassy like hostage in 1979 and 1980. And basically this led to a massive kind of crisis, and this led to Iran, which had, you know, up until that point been a staunch like ally of America, being like, you know, a great enemy, right? And you know the Iranians referring to them as being the great Satan, basically, and calling Israel the little Satan. So basically Iran's whole geopolitical kind of like orientation completely flipped with this thing as well. So much so that during the Iran-Iraq War, you know, it's now been released that the CIA had a part in basically you know, selling chemical weapons like to Iraq, and then also like directing basically chemical attacks against the Iranian soldiers, right? And this at a point when the Iranians looked like they might start winning and might start like pushing the Iraqis back. So big level of interference in a lot of like Iran's like you know, inner workings and stuff, yeah. And this is kind of one of the things that led to the revolution, because they didn't want like this foreign intervention.